So it's great to be here. I think this is my third time at the Austrian Economics Discord conference giving a talk. Last time I talked about regulations, and that is sort of a project that I'm working on and have been working on for a while. And now, considering the incoming president and his Department of Government Efficiency, I'm sort of fast-tracking a project that the tentative title in a way is called How to Think About Regulations. Just to show to the regime and to Elon Musk and everybody how destructive regulations really are. So that's what I need to get done. What I have get done, however, is something that I'm going to talk about today. So I have a new book coming out hopefully in February. That is part of a Element series, it's called, with Cambridge University Press, which means it's a really short book. It's even shorter, actually, than the primer that you mentioned. It's part of the Evolutionary Economics series. And the point of the Element series is that it should be really, really short parts so that you can pick 4 or 5 of them and make them into a textbook. So think of this as a sort of a quarter textbook or a fifth of the textbook or something like that. And that's the wrong slides. Hold on. Let me try again. It's better with this year's slides, I think. All right. So and this new book, I'm sort of addressing a project that I worked on in parallel with regulations, that is on entrepreneurship. And I think I've talked to many of you before on entrepreneurship and Mises' concept of the promoter and how that is undefined by Mises, but is super important, and Mises recognized this as well. But we need a praxeological definition in order to use this concept to understand the economy, and Mises was unable to go there. He says that you can't define it with praxeological rigor. I made an attempt to do that in a paper I published in 2020, which I'll get to in a bit. And in this short book, what I'm doing is sort of addressing the implications of this concept for how we view the market process. And I think a lot of people, mainstreamers definitely, and all kinds of traditions or literatures that are sort of closer to Austrian economics than the mainstream is, they tend to be dynamic. They tend to adopt process view. They tend to adopt entrepreneurship and things like that, but they tend to also get it wrong. And unfortunately, I think a lot of Austrians also get it wrong. So I'm going to address that here in terms of 3 core terms that I think Austrians use a lot, but that we need to figure out how they relate to each other and what they actually mean. And those are uncertainty, entrepreneurship, and knowledge. And they're sort of very closely related. And this is the forthcoming book, which has this really boring title, Entrepreneurship and Evolutionary Economics. It's really about the implications of entrepreneurship. So I'm giving you sort of a brief summary in this talk of the book. And of course, I would love if you would get the book and give me feedback on that later on when it's published. I think it's going to be available, at least the digital format will be available for free at first, but then it's not going to be very costly, so don't worry about that. So if we get to the first concept, uncertainty, the typical reference when discussing uncertainty is Frank Knight, who's sort of a father of the Chicago School of Economics. And he was famous and is famous still for his distinction between risk and uncertainty. This is a distinction that is core in entrepreneurship studies. It's a distinction that we sort of use a little on and off in Austrian economics as well. It's something that mainstream economists have forgotten about completely. Probably because Knight, when he was young, in his book, Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, is his dissertation. And he was pretty much Austrian back in the day. And then he was enamored, as many were, with math and that sort of thing. But here in his book, he distinguishes between 3 types of probabilities, if you will. And he talks about a priori probability, which is basically if you have a die with 6 sides, you know that each side, if it's a fair die, has 1/6 of a chance of turning up. So you don't really need to throw the die or anything like that. You can calculate it a priori. It's no big deal. There's also statistical probability, so you can take that same die, you can throw it 1 billion times, and then you can record what sides come up, and you can get an idea of which side is more likely and that sort of thing. And whatever is not in either of these 2 categories is what he referred to as true uncertainty, which means that we simply cannot tell. We have no basis for making judgments about the probabilities of one outcome or the other. So we might not even know what the outcomes might be. And that's, of course, a huge problem, because any mathematical method, and Paul Swick talked a little bit about this, any mathematical method needs to already, at the starting point, know the outcomes so that you can then calculate the probabilities, which is highly problematic, because in the market economists we'll get to, there's really no such thing as a known set of outcomes, and there's also no knowledge about the probabilities of whatever outcomes there are. So with uncertainty at the core, which of course all Austrians pretty much have at the core, we have a huge problem that we need to solve. And it's not merely a problem of having asymmetric or imperfect information, which of course it is, because uncertainty means we don't know stuff. But it's not a formal problem in the sense that we can calculate, how much knowledge don't we have and how much should we need in order to make a good forecast. Because those are sort of games that we can play logically and in math, but they don't actually tell us a whole lot about the real world. Mises in Human Action, many of you already know probably, distinguishes between class and case probability, terms that he borrowed from his brother Richard von Mises. And class probability simply means that you have a class of different events or a class of different types of objects, categories, in which you can calculate the probability that some event will happen. So insurance companies do this, right? So you can have a certain number of houses in an area or in a town, and you can offer insurance and know that in general, this or that many houses will burn down in a regular year, and therefore you can sort of spread the cost of rebuilding that house through insurance, which means you can relieve the house owner, who doesn't know if his house is going to burn down, of that uncertainty by instead involving the whole class and spreading the risk. And then it becomes a risk, so it's probabilistic rather than completely unknown, if you will. And Mises argues that economic action and basically anything that praxeology addresses is always subject to case probability, which means what are the chances that this one house, my house, will burn down in the next year? Well, we simply can't tell. We don't have any information about that. We can tell about the whole city in general. We can calculate a priori or statistically, as Knight talked about, but we can't know for this specific house. There's simply no way. And in terms of our actions, we always strive towards some end, but we don't really know the value of that end until we get there. And we also don't know exactly the nature of that end. I mean, we have an imagined view of what that end will be like, but we might not actually get there, and it might take a different shape, or we might get to a completely different end. Who knows? And that is actually a fundamental problem in the economy as well as in economics, that Mainstream economics, of course, completely disregards, because it's much easier if you disregard that problem. The issue, of course, with just disregarding the problem that is fundamental to the economy is, well, what are you actually explaining if you're getting rid of the problems by assumption or by assertion? You don't actually explain anything that is real anymore. This takes us to, or leads us to, entrepreneurship for Mises, and he uses entrepreneurship in two different ways in Human Action and his other works. And in the broad sense, and sort of as a praxeological category, it's just the uncertainty-bearing aspect of every human action, that we don't know the actual outcome or the value thereof of any action that we take. Sometimes it's not really important. So if I go to the bathroom, I can't know exactly the outcome of it. I don't know if it's going to be successful or not, but I have a pretty good idea. That has no impact on the economy, really, but there is an uncertainty always. I mean, who knows? I could have a heart attack on the way to the bathroom. I could have some other accident. Anything could happen in a sense, but typically we don't really bother with those small sort of things. And even though every action is, by definition, in this sense, speculative and therefore entrepreneurial, it's not all that important. And in the evenly rotating economy, we sort of get rid of this aspect of human action, but we study the rest of economic actors and how the economy works. In the narrow sense, so that's where it gets exciting and interesting. Mises talks about the promoter, which is a concept that economics cannot do without. And the promoter is sort of the actor who brings about big changes in the economy and readjusts the production structure, if you will, in order to produce something that hasn't been seen before, or something that might affect people's behavior, that is, consumers' behavior, and therefore sort of shifts or changes the fabric of the production structure and the market structure overall. And that, of course, is necessary to understand in order to understand the market as a process, and also where it's headed and where economic growth comes from. So a question to ask then is that what kind of uncertainty is actually borne by the promoter? And how do we connect these two, since uncertainty is part of every action, but promoter is a specific type of action or actor even? Well, it's not technology. It's not whether you know if the technology you're applying in your production will create this certain type of gadget, or if the gadget will work, because that is simply a matter of knowledge. So you can study more engineering, you can invest in more research in engineering and what have you, and just learn about the world and develop the sciences and things like that. That's not really uncertainty in Mises's view. The promoter is sort of a catalactic entrepreneur. So it's an entrepreneur acting within the price system through exchanges and through transactions between people in a market setting, which means that the uncertainty of the future, which is what we're talking about here, is not really the uncertainty of, say, autarkic exchange, which is just me exchanging with myself, my acting without involving anybody else, but catalactic exchange. So this uncertainty that is borne by the promoter is necessarily what are the future conditions of the market. And specifically, that would be, okay, what will be the demand of the goods that I set out to produce right now? So I haven't produced them yet, but I will offer them in the future. And at that point in time, how much will consumers value my offering? And how will they rank them compared to all the other goods that will be offered in that market situation? And that's sort of what promoters and market entrepreneurs, if you will, have to wrestle with and have to overcome, and they have to bear that uncertainty. So what entrepreneurs do in the economy from the sort of economic process perspective is that they imagine and they attempt to foresee these future conditions, and thereby try to position their own actions in terms of production of goods and services so that they can satisfy the most urgent wants of consumers in a future that is still unknown and is still not existent either, because it will be existent in the future, and part of it will be brought about by the entrepreneur himself too. Okay, so This leads us to other theories of entrepreneurship that Austrian scholars have discussed and elaborated on, and of course, most famously is Israel Kirzner, who's sort of the only great Austrian still alive. In Kirzner's theory, the entrepreneur is an arbitrager or equilibrator. So, in a disequilibrium setting, the entrepreneur sees price discrepancies and takes advantage of seeing those price discrepancies simply by knowing the prices are low over here, but they're high over there. I can buy here and sell there, and therefore make a profit. Entrepreneurship is simply the perception of this price discrepancy, and then the acting on it, starting a firm and producing and so forth, is different from the pure entrepreneurship in Kirzner's view. But what he's saying here is that the price discrepancy, of course, exists because prices are objective and they're existent in the marketplace, and it's just the arbitrage, or just the arbitrage. It's of course important, but it's the arbitrage between the prices that are already in existence. That is what the entrepreneur addresses and fixes, if you will. And this is similar to Hayek's knowledge problem, the way he puts it in his 1945 article, The Use of Knowledge in Society, where he talks about prices as information, which is a great insight. But in his view, very much like Kirzner, entrepreneurs respond to these market data that already exist. So even though prices change in Hayek's discussion, prices change, and then entrepreneurs react and they change their actions based off of this. Well, of course they change because the costs of their inputs change, so they will act differently. So they will, I mean, it's the invisible hand in a sense, but in different language. Okay, so I put this in three separate models with increasing levels of complexity, if you will, in the book when I discuss it. And I start with a model that is consider any market that is just in this equilibrium, but it's not subject to any specific changes. So don't expect resources to change or the resource supply to change. We don't expect any changes in technological knowledge. We don't expect changes in consumer preferences or anything like that. Instead, we just know that resources are not allocated perfectly. In this model, how can you make a profit? Well, you allocate resources better than they were previously allocated. So it's about correcting the errors that had happened before. And of course, what you do then is follow the prices. If there's a price discrepancy, you of course move resources from where they have a low price to where they have a high price, which is where they have been over allocated to those production processes. You buy them there and you take them from those and you invest them instead in those production processes where they have been underinvested. So you change the allocation toward where they serve consumers better. And since we're holding everything pretty much constant around this marketplace, this is going to be an equilibrating market process, and eventually you're going to run out of opportunities as well, because eventually it's similar to the evenly rotating economy. The first stage anyway, where people sort of finding their maximizing activities and their maximizing productions. The second model, I introduce exogenous changes. So here, there are changes in the supply of resources or factors used, and consumers change their preferences. So they might have before have a preferred good A to good B in overall, but then suddenly something happens, whatever that might be, they might just change their mind. So now consumers overall prefer good B to good A. This of course means that resources need to be reallocated, even if they were, say, perfectly allocated before. What is now perfect has changed, so it is a moving target, if you will. So this changes the entrepreneurial role a little bit, because here you can respond to changes, you can respond to price discrepancies, but even better is probably if you imagine what might happen, and you try to foresee and you try to meet those changes that will happen. It's a very high risk strategy, but it might actually mean that you can exploit the full difference if you do it right. In Model 3, I introduce endogenous changes, which means that the technology can change and the types of goods that are offered in the marketplace can change. So here I really introduce the promoter, which is a disruptor or innovator, who imagines how he can produce a good that better serves consumers. And if that is the case, then of course this person will be able to completely disrupt whatever everybody else is doing. So whatever strategies were sort of maximizing strategies, if you will, in models 1 and 2 are no longer good strategies, because anything can be undermined by the promoter, who can come out of left field pretty much and produce something new that completely undermines or pulls the rug from under your feet. As an entrepreneur, you were doing the right thing. You were serving consumers, but now this other guy serves these consumers in a better way, and therefore there's simply no demand for your product anymore. Okay, so just by putting this in these three models where you add complexity, what do we learn about these core concepts? Uncertainty, knowledge, and entrepreneurship. Well, is there uncertainty in the Misesian sense in Model 1? No, there's not. There are no changes at all. The only thing that happens is that we're correcting errors and we're equilibrating the market, and we're constantly getting closer to this equilibrium point, this maximizing point. In Model 2, there's also no uncertainty really. There's could be a change in consumer preferences of goods, but there's nothing disrupting the production structures. It's a matter of allocation between production processes. In Model 3, of course, yes, there is uncertainty, and there's uncertainty pretty much everywhere, because you can't really trust that what happened yesterday will repeat itself tomorrow, or that it will even be a relevant fact when you set out and produce your good, or whatever production process you might have already started to undertake. What about knowledge? Well, in Model 1, yes, there is knowledge. And that the knowledge is already there in terms of prices and price discrepancies. You can just react to those and respond to those changes, and that knowledge that is already available. The same thing in Model 2, because the prices will reflect the accuracy, in a sense, of the resource allocations between the production processes that exist. So the knowledge that you have might change over time, but it's still knowledge of what exists. In Model 3, there is no such knowledge, because you don't know if what you're doing today is actually going to create value, because value itself of the outcome is uncertain, because it can be undermined completely by a promoter, or it can be really valuable. Who knows? You don't really know at all. So this means for entrepreneurship that in Model 1, and I already discussed this a little bit, in Model 1, the maximizing strategy is to reallocate resources in response to those existing price differences that you can just look at in the marketplace. Whoever sees them first has a greater chance of making profit. In Model 2, you reallocate resources, but you have to also keep an eye on and try to figure out what changes might happen, because prices are expected to change. Not in response only to the allocations that happen, but because maybe consumers will change their preferences. And in Model 3, you really have no choice but to allocate resources and engage in production based on your imagined satisfaction that you can offer consumers at whatever point in time you think that you might be done and have the offering available to them in the marketplace. But you don't really know anything about what those market conditions might look like. Okay, so what types of entrepreneurship are we talking about here? Well, in Model 1, there's definitely alertness and there's arbitration and that sort of thing going on. In Model 2 as well, even though sometimes you might act on your perception of what price changes might happen, what price changes you expect. And in Model 3, of course, it's promotership, or the promoter entrepreneur is the main actor. And it sort of forces everybody else to become a promoter, because you can't really rest on your laurels, because the rug that you're standing on might be pulled from under your feet. This means then that there's no uncertainty really at all, or the type of uncertainty available in Model 1 is none at all. In Model 2, you guess the quantities of allocations based off of the expected price changes, perhaps. And in Model 3, uncertainty is both caused and borne by entrepreneurs themselves. Okay, so what do we learn by this? Is this just repackaging of what we know already? No, I don't think it is, because what we're saying here is that promoters really cause uncertainty by disrupting production. And since they're pursuing value for consumers, they're starting with the end product, and they have to. And that justifies what they can pay for, factors that they will use, and which factors they want to use. It also means that any type of production, even production that is already undertaken and underway, is uncertain, because you don't know if what you're producing today and will be done tomorrow will actually see a market. So the market conditions change because of entrepreneurship. There's an endogenous sort of creation of this uncertainty. We also learned that without these promoters, there's much less uncertainty, because there's no endogenously caused uncertainty. But there can also be no progress in the market, because those new types of production, those new goods that in a sense are creatively destructive, as Schumpeter talked about, don't come to be at all. So it really is the case that the promoter is the driving force of the market economy, if you will. And this is why economic calculation is then necessary for a progressing economy, because there can be no value knowledge whatsoever. You can't know that something will be of value, and therefore you can't know what the outcome is. And knowledge doesn't really play into what you're doing. You can have all kinds of say, technological knowledge or engineering knowledge, or you can have knowledge of what happened in past markets and how consumers reacted to whatever in the past. But that really only informs you about what might be possible, but it doesn't tell you what will happen. It doesn't even tell you the probabilities of what will happen. So knowledge is the outcome of entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurs figure out what was the case as a result. So when they earn a profit or a loss, then they learn that, oh, I did the right thing. But that does not really instruct them in the sense that, oh, then that means I can do the same thing and therefore make a profit. No, that knowledge, when it is learned, and when it is generated, in a sense, is already past due. So knowledge is not really actionable at all, and it's not a problem that we can overcome. It's an outcome of the market process and nothing else, which means we have to focus on how entrepreneurs and promoters make decisions and how they create this wealth that we're experiencing. Okay, so what are the implications? Well, I'm writing the book for an evolutionary economics book series, and the core of the evolutionary economics is that they see the economy as an evolutionary process. So it's sort of Darwinian, and they even use terms and analogies from biology and that sort of thing. But in biological evolution, there is a selection mechanism, and what mutations happen are random. That is not the case in the economy. In the economy, the variation that happens is not random at all. It is based on what entrepreneurs think will be of greatest value for consumers at a future point in time. So there's already selection of the variations that happen, which is not the case in biology. And the selection of which ones were successful happen after they have already been carried out. And at that point, some entrepreneurs who introduce the variation might be weeded out, whereas others are rewarded with profits. But it's not the selection of what is better in the economy that is selected. what was better in the economy that is rewarded after the fact. So in a sense, they reverse causality, and it's the same thing with economic growth models in mainstream economics. Whether it's the exogenous growth model or endogenous growth model, they're based on the implications of knowledge. But from an Austrian perspective, or at least that's my argument, knowledge is the outcome of the market process, and it's not really a basis for future entrepreneurship, what was good entrepreneurship in the past. So that knowledge is not really useful. What is useful is, of course, technological knowledge and things like that, but that gives us no indication whatsoever of the value of what we can produce. And Mises is very clear on this, of course, in Human Action, distinguishing between entrepreneurship and technology development. In mainstream economics, they don't have this distinction, probably because they don't have an entrepreneur even. Okay, so this, of course, also means that we have to, in Austrian theory, think of economic growth as necessarily entrepreneurial, and that we have to embrace uncertainty as not only a category of the sort of framework within or context within which we act, but rather an outcome of the action itself as well. So whereas entrepreneurs through economic calculation figure stuff out and sort of guide each other through determining prices, it's also the case that whoever gets it right undermines more or less completely what others were attempting who didn't get it right. It's not a matter of knowledge whatsoever. We can't even use that term because that's just the outcome, and we learn knowledge of what was the case before. So the knowledge that we've learned is only applicable to the past in terms of market knowledge in a way. Okay, so of course there's more about this in the book. I elaborate on it quite a bit more. But I'd be happy to take your questions on this or any other topic you're interested in discussing.
Thank you very much. I just had a quick question to kick things off here for the Q&A. Several weeks ago, Brian Albrecht, I'm not sure if you're familiar with him or not, but he published an article on his Substack talking a little bit about Schumpeterian creative destruction and how some of those insights might be compatible with Austrian entrepreneurship insights. Specifically, he was talking about Kerzner and others like that. Do you think those two kind of ideas are compatible? Do you think they have a lot of similarities? Do you think they have interactions? What do you think about really the relationship between those two kind of traditions?
Between Schumpeter and the Austrians?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a huge question. I mean, I think in a sense, I've been trying to dig into this in another paper of mine, try to figure out, because there are obvious similarities between Mises's promoter and Schumpeter's, at least his early version of creative destruction. I mean, creative destruction is a term he used in the 1940s in Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. Whereas in the Theory of Economic Development from 1911, he talks about the entrepreneur as sort of a heroic disruptor by creating new value. It is true that he starts with sort of a circular flow, which is sometimes people talk about it as an equilibrium. I don't think it is an equilibrium as much as it is the absence of something disruptive. So it's more of an evenly rotating economy than an equilibrium. But you can read it also as an application of Say's law. What's interesting here, I think, is that Mises and Schumpeter were in von Bawerk's seminar for PhD students at the same time. And they were, of course, both, Mises took that seminar many years, but they were both highly influenced by von Bawerk and his view on both time and production structures and things like that. So what I've been trying to figure out is how close are Mises and Schumpeter's views of this disruptive type of entrepreneurship, and how does that relate to von Bawerk's theory, and I haven't really gotten very far in figuring this out yet, but there's definitely some similarity here. Whereas from my perspective, Kerzner's entrepreneur, for instance, is quite different from the promoter, and it applies to sort of the pure function of entrepreneurship that he tries to explain. That he takes from human action, but that Mises doesn't get into, because Mises says, well, it doesn't really matter. It's not very interesting because you can't be a pure entrepreneur. And Kerzner sort of takes that concept and just runs with it. And I think the problem there is that he focuses on, and I covered this a little bit in my presentation, that he focuses on the arbitrage between the data points that are already in existence. And I think that is misconstruing the market process and really reversing causality, because first of all, there's no uncertainty really in there, even though he tried to shoehorn it in later on. And you start with this knowledge as sort of an epiphany, and the pure entrepreneur can't really suffer a loss, can only make a profit by being alert to these opportunities. But those opportunities don't really exist. And I think from a Mengerian point of view, where the value is realized not until the final good is being consumed and used, then there is no such thing as making these profits that Kerzner, at least in a quick reading, talks about.
All right, thank you very much. We have another quick question here we'll try to shoe in. Future is uncertain, and so are future prices. Whenever you arbitrage, although the price you buy at is a present price and it's known, the price you want to sell at is a future price and thus unknown. The question is, how can it just be alertness if not certain what the future price would be? I guess this is sort of in reference to Kerznerian views of entrepreneurship.
Yeah, right. So I mean, there's definitely arbitrage going on. So the way I see the economic calculation process is that you have plenty of entrepreneurs, and they imagine that they can produce certain goods that they will be able to sell at a certain price. I mean, that's the appraisement process that Mises talks about. So say I produce a widget, and I think that I will be able to sell 10,000 of them for $100 each. So I will have revenue of $1 million. And then based off of that appraisement, I will then go into the market and I will place bids for those inputs that I think are necessary in order to produce this thing. So the value of what I'm producing, that appraisement, which of course is a guess, is the ceiling for how much I can bid for the resources. And in the market, in the economic calculation process, all these entrepreneurs are bidding against each other based off of the value that they think that they will be producing. If it is the case that the value of factors are different in different places, of course it can be a arbitrage between them. That's not that strange. And I don't in any sense reject that this happens. I mean, that's where the law of one price comes from, that there is a tendency towards one price in the market. My view is, however, that this is a sort of a minor point in economics. It's not all that important. What is important is, where do the prices come from? Not how are they equilibrated, if you will. And they're going to be disrupted over time anyway, because all it takes is a couple of entrepreneurs who imagine that they can create even more value and therefore outbid everybody with those resources, which raises the price. Or that something happens to the supply and therefore the price will go up, or what have you. So the prices will change, and the arbitration of it, yes, that is true, but that is really just the sort of tendency towards the one price for the factor given the market data, but the market data changes all the time.
All right, we'll try to fit one more question in here before we move on to our next speaker. Given what we have learned, how can we best recast what problem is solved in the act of economic calculation, and how is that problem solved in a market of privately owned factors of production?
Yeah, so that's talk about a core question. Economic calculation is necessary in a progressing economy for the simple reason that promoters cause uncertainty by their actions, or we as entrepreneurs in the marketplace, if you will, create uncertainty by bidding for different ways of satisfying consumers. So the economic calculation process establishes market prices for factors based off of entrepreneurs' bids that are in turn based on the ceiling prices that they can pay, that they think that they can afford based on their guesses of how much value they can produce. Which means the market prices reflect, yes, the scarcity or the relative scarcities of the factors, true, but they also reflect the value that entrepreneurs as a collective or as a body that together believe that those factors can generate in the marketplace, because they are all bidding based on the value that they're creating, right? So what this means is that economic calculation produces prices of factors today based on all the entrepreneurs' guesses of how much value those factors will contribute in production of goods that will be consumed tomorrow. So it's in a sense, it's a way of producing prices to guide actions today based off of values that will value that will only be in existence in the future. So in a sense, it's making the future the present based on all those guesses out there. And Mises refers to this as a division of intellectual labor, right? The intellectual labor is the entrepreneurs imagining and taking into account all different kinds of things that they think are relevant, and estimating the value of what they're going to produce. But they're all doing this individually, and they're learning from each other and whatever else, and they're making all these guesses. But they're pursuing profit, and they're lured by profit, but they're tempered by the risk of losing. And since all of them are doing this without any limitations, really, except for the financial conditions, right, that they can't outbid, they can't all get their hands on the resources. That means that the production structure itself, through the prices that they generate, will follow what entrepreneurs themselves think are the most valuable uses of factors. But note that what this means is that in an economy that is not a market process, that is not progressing in the sense that it's creating more and more prosperity, economic calculation is not as much of a problem. So it's a problem if you are trying to generate, or if you want to generate prosperity in society. So it's less of a problem for socialists who don't care if people are equally poor as long as they're equal, right? But if you want to make society rich, and you want consumers to be satisfied to the greatest extent possible, it's necessary to have this process, and there's no other such process. And private property, of course, is necessary for this, for the simple reason that if you don't personally lose from making the wrong bids, well, then you're just playing a game for fun, and it's your bids are no longer tempered by that personal risk of losing. And so it needs to be you that have skin in the game in order for you to act as reasonably as you can. So you can't really have a committee of people who don't have any skin in the game set those prices or act on those prices or whatever, because they have nothing to lose if they get it wrong.
All right. Well, thank you very much for presenting here today. Where can everybody find you at, and do you have anything that you want to plug?
Well, I mean, my whole presentation was a plug in a sense, right? Since it's my forthcoming book. So do check that out when it's available. I am pretty active on X or Twitter. So it's just at my name, so at Per Bylund. I also write a little now and then at Mises.org. And I'm probably, it's easiest to find me probably on X.
All right. Well, thank you very much for speaking here today. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.